Welcome to Teacher Talks, a podcast where teachers from the Shorewood School District come together to share their knowledge around current topics. We have created this podcast to stay connected to our district and the wider community during this time of school closure due to the coronavirus. I am Mr. Sam Nadolski, 7th grade math teacher at Shorewood Intermediate School.
And I am Mr. Kearns, Geometry and Algebra 2 teacher at Shorewood High School. We've all been watching the news and have heard lots about the government intervening, trying to help us in times of crisis like this. Today we're interested in learning what exactly is the government's role in a time of crisis such as this. Luckily today we have a guest who specializes in teaching students the duties of government and politics of our country. Mr. John Jacobson joins us today. John is the American Government and Political Theory teacher at Shorewood High School. John, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, guys. Thanks for having me.
What have you been up to during this school closure?
Well, the day we got the announcement that we were going to be off through until April 13th, I got out of Wisconsin pretty quickly because I had a pressing family matter unfolding at about the same time. My sister has been going through cancer treatments, and she lives up in Canada. My mother has been up there with her helping out. She has 2 younger children, and we had just kind of gotten to the point where my sister's recovery was going really well, and it looked like it was okay for my mom to come back home. My mom is 76, and for a variety of reasons, we were concerned about her being too far away from her own doctors and whatnot. So I came down here. We have a farm down here in central Illinois. So I came down here to take care of a few things that needed attention to right away. And then I turned around and drove to the Canadian border just north of Detroit, where my brother-in-law brought my mother to literally the other side of the border. And then we did a transfer, basically, of my mom and managed to get her to the American side of the border about 3 hours before the border closed. Wow. And that was it was an extraordinary experience because I even got held for extra questioning and whatnot when a Canadian customs agent asked me how long did I intend to be in Canada, and I said, I think about 15 minutes. And they didn't like that answer, understandably so. So that, but I wasn't going to lie to a Canadian customs agent. They were also going to see me coming back over the border about 15 minutes later. So that subjected me to some extra questions, which again, I understood. And then got over, picked up my mom, got her back, and got back down here to central Illinois. And that's where I've been ever since.
Well, glad to hear that you are in a safe spot, at least for the time being.
I am about as socially distanced as you could be. I'm in the middle of 8 acres in a big, lovely house all by myself. We were talking before the podcast here that I've been visited by some coyotes, quite a few deer, some foxes, or fox. I don't know what plural for fox is. And it's remarkable because I've probably seen more wildlife here in the past week than I've seen in the previous 5 years. Absolutely. And neighbors, that I'm chatting with or texting with, everybody's saying the same thing. And our theory is that, they sense what's going on. There is just less of a human presence out there right now. And it does not take nature long to adjust to that. And so they're treading very carefully onto turf that they had marked before as belonging to the humans that we are vacating as a result of social distancing. So I haven't confronted anything like face to face out in the way. I see all of this mainly from this room. This room's got windows on all 3 sides as you come into it. And I look out over about 8 to 10 acres of open timberland. So I've been on the good side of the glass, so to speak, especially with the coyotes. One coyote is okay. 2 or 3 coyotes, those are pack hunting animals. You don't want to mess with that situation. So I just let them have the run of the place, basically. And, but that's been a really interesting development in all of this.
Yeah, I do. I've heard some stories about some wild animals emerging in cities and towns. So I
Oh
think
yeah,
you're spot on with they sense new territory opportunities and they're out.
yes. And here they don't have. I mean, it was already pretty much halfway belonging to them anyway. Now it's like I can't imagine what's going on in their heads. Like like where is everybody?
So one of the things that Stephen and I were hoping to chat with you about was just the role of government during a pandemic like this. And I think we've seen some actual press conferences coming out of our federal government, which is the first in many years here. But could you maybe just summarize, just to get our conversation going, like during a time of crisis, what is the role of the federal government? What do citizens generally expect from their national leaders in a time like this?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, they expect leadership. They want to know that somebody is in charge and that somebody is on top of things and that somebody is operating with a plan to try to rectify the situation at hand. I think that there is probably a natural desire for some positivity in all of that, but there needs to also be a balance between being positive and being realistic. And I think we've seen various leaders, governors, some of the individuals in the federal government doing a decent job of that. I have had only maybe 2 or 3 occasions where I really felt like I was being, sort of condescended to or talked down to. I feel like the vast majority of the communication has been frank, and I can usually measure that by hearing what I don't necessarily want to hear. Happy opening day for Major League Baseball, by the way. Although we can't blame that on any government. And we shouldn't be blaming it on anybody because it's the right thing to do. But, I think that there is sometimes a strong correlation between the workability of leadership and how often you find yourself being disappointed in the outcomes. And all I mean by that is, there pandemics, clearly, this is the first major pandemic I've lived through. Pandemics are clearly not a lot of fun, and they, obligate us to live in a way that is not a preference. So the fact that I feel like that's been consistently communicated to me by most leaders, I think is a good sign. Along with all of that, though, I think what people expect of government is they expect results. They expect policies that will address the issue at hand. And on that, I feel like we're all over the place. And to a certain extent, that's the structure of our system, right? A federal system balances power between states and the federal government. The federal government has more of the power, of course, but states are given some sovereignty to attend to things in their own way. And, I think we've seen obviously some states like California, now I would say Wisconsin and a few others that have, been way out in front of this as best they can to deal with it head on and somewhat aggressively. And then we've seen some other states that have frankly done very little, if anything. I think they're starting to come around right now, but some states, particularly in the Southeast, I think have been a little disappointing in terms of how they've addressed this. And then there's the federal government, and it's also a mixed bag, right? What part of the federal government do we want to talk about? Anytime Anthony Fauci is speaking, I'm all ears. I love listening to that guy because to me he is the epitome of not talking down. He is a straight shooter. He doesn't try to scare or intimidate with the vast amount of knowledge that he has, but he can, tell it like it is. And then you have some other individuals who are in more politicized roles who are trying to walk that fine line that's always so difficult. I'm the son of an elected official, so I saw firsthand growing up how difficult that can be, where your job is to lead, and sometimes leadership is about, like I said, telling people what they don't want to hear, but your job is also to maintain a certain amount of popularity so that, you can do things like win elections and stuff like that. And there's a whole separate debate over which of those two things should win out in a time like this. My personal preference is the leadership, even if it costs you your job as an elected official. But it's difficult to do. Winston Churchill has a great quote that we use in my classes a lot, where he said this: democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And I think that just beautifully captures the dilemma you have when you're in a crisis, because again, it's no joke. You got to tell people things. Hey, you got to do this. You got to do, and you're not going to necessarily like it. And on the other hand, in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I'm an elected official, and large numbers of people not liking what I tell them is not usually good for my job security. So that's a dilemma, but we're getting, like I said, a mixed bag of quality in terms of that leadership right now.
Yeah, I was actually just going to bring up Churchill, because I know that Trump has referenced himself as a wartime president, and when I think of quality wartime presidents, I do think of Churchill, and just the balance of, like, we're in a really tough time, so we're gonna experience some downsides to this, but there is an end. We will come out stronger, and if we're working together, we're stronger. And I see that sort of two-pronged message as positive leadership in a time of crisis. Are we getting, so I second Fauci, and just being super grateful that there's someone with some common sense talking to us in some of these press briefings and stuff. But are we getting the message that times are going to be tough, but we're going to get out of this? Or are we just getting one side of that message right now?
Are we talking about who is the messenger in that question?
Let's talk about federally. Let's talk about Trump.
Well, I was disappointed the other day when he made the comments about everything being up and running again by, I think he said by Easter.
By Easter.
So yep. I'm assuming that's mid-April. Did a little follow-up on that on my own, and read into where that advice was coming from, and came away pretty quickly with the following conclusion: none of the healthcare professionals that have his ear are telling him that. Starting with guys like Fauci, he is not hearing that from. How about this? He's not hearing that from doctors. He's not hearing that from anybody at the National Institute of Health. He's not hearing that from the Surgeon General. He's not hearing that from anybody who is a trained, licensed healthcare professional who works in the medical field. And it seems to have resonated more like one of his occasional tricks, which is to go off script with what everybody thought he was going to say initially. And if you actually watch the video, or maybe sometimes it's even better to just listen to the audio of when he said that, the vocal inflection is consistent with the other times in his presidency where he has essentially made policy on the spot without the consensus, in all likelihood, of his policy advisors. Now, he's obviously got some people who are telling him, to say those types of things. Will be up and running by Easter. But again, none of those people work in the healthcare, the field of healthcare. So that's concerning to me. I feel like when he speaks, he, like so often, we don't know what's coming. And what we need is consistency. We need, a calm demeanor. We need a sense that a grand plan is in place and is being adhered to. And when you have moments like we're going to be up and running by Easter, well, then I think that starts to undermine some of the confidence in that leadership. So on the federal level, it's a really difficult situation, because there are certain things that need to be done to address this crisis that only the federal government can do. We forget that there is no bigger institution in the world than the United States federal government. That is not hyperbole. I mean, it makes Amazon look like a corner dime store. Its budget is over $4 trillion a year. Nobody on the planet employs more individuals than the United States federal government. It has the ability to open up a line of credit that is, again, you don't see anywhere else in the world. And so when you have a legitimate international crisis like this, only the federal government, with all due respect to states like New York and Texas and Florida and whatnot, which are big states, only the federal government can address some of these issues. There's no business in the world or no collection of businesses in the world that can do it on their own. But if we don't have that faith in the consistency of policy coming from the Fed, then we're going to do what I think you're seeing a lot of people do, which is to turn to their states, to turn to their local governments, and in the end, and this is really more of my political theory class than anything else, but turn to their communities, without the sanction of formal policy, but neighbors watching out for and taking care of neighbors, in the absence of real leadership from the highest places possible.
Sure. I think it all comes back to kind of that approach of whether you want to be a leader and kind of speak exactly what people need to hear or what they want to hear. And are you looking at getting reelected, or are you looking at kind of telling the truth? And I think that's kind of what, when we're talking about Trump and what he's talking about opening up by Easter, that may be what people want to hear, but is it exactly what people need to hear? And there's a fine line there, and it's interesting.
And I don't go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, even if it's what we want to hear, I don't know that many people with whom it resonates as credible. And where I am right now is Donald Trump country. I'm in a county that voted 77% for Donald Trump, and in central Illinois, Livingston County, Illinois. And the conversations that I've had, again, socially distanced conversations or text chats or whatnot, I've interacted with a number of individuals who are staunch Donald Trump supporters, who are my friends and my neighbors, and nobody's buying that. Nobody, people aren't stupid. I mean, they look around, they hear something like that, and then they see what's happening in the world, and I don't see how this is going to happen in 3 weeks, which is what's most disappointing, because I think the president, I think he's got a unique opportunity here to just be really frank with people in a way that will help him. Because in a time of crisis, what people want more than anything, I think, is honesty. As things were unfolding, I don't know how you guys were, but in my classroom over the course of that last week, where every day and every hour of every day brought new revelations about what was going on out there. And granted, my students are all juniors and seniors, but I just said, guys, you're either adults or you're effectively adults. So let's just have a conversation like adults. We're not going to try to scare each other or anything like that, but let's just deal with this at the level of what we think we are watching happen out there. And I got the feeling that students really craved that. They didn't want to be treated like kids. They wanted to be given direct, transparent information about the situation at hand. And I think you can extrapolate that to the general public with government. I think you can say, look, if it's bad news, give it to me straight. And then I know what I'm dealing with. The root of most anxiety is when you can't see or can't comprehend what you perceive to be a threat. If you can face it straight up, then at least you know what you're dealing with, and then you can start to get to work on how you're going to deal with it. But you've sort of eliminated the ghost that lingers in your closet, so to speak. You've opened your closet and said, here we go. Okay, this is what I have to deal with, and let's get after it. And that's an opportunity. That's a real opportunity for leaders out there to be honest and be straightforward and not cloak, not smoke and mirror the policies that they're putting out there. And I think some leaders are taking advantage of that, and some leaders are missing the boat on it altogether.
Sure. So we are in an election year, and we've already seen many statewide primaries have to deal with how to handle kind of polling places during this time of social distancing. How do you think kind of this quarantine could affect the election coming up this year?
The election in November, or the primary elections that we still have to go through? I
guess both. Yeah, primary right now is probably more significantly hit by the quarantine effect. But long run, we don't know how long it could last.
Right, and I think it's so difficult to get your head around what's going to happen in November, because we like to think that life will be back to normal by November. But there've been a few people out there who have suggested that this could last 5, 6, 7 months, and what is this? This is the third. So even if that's the case, that still gives us room before the election, the federal election, the national election. But I don't know about you guys, but I don't necessarily see us just snapping our fingers and everything's back to the way it was. Once we can start to lift some of this quarantine, social distance stuff that's going on out there. So there's going to need to be a ramp up period. Can you get your infrastructure up and running in a way where people are comfortable enough to go to the polling places in large enough numbers to give the results of your election a sense of credibility? And that's, I think, the thing that I worry about the most. We'll get a bit of a free pass with the primaries, because primary elections tend to have fairly low voter turnout anyway. In fact, in some cases, it's reprehensibly low. Without a crisis going on, you get some primary voter turnout rates that are less than 20%. But an election where everything's really on the line, like what we have coming in November, the biggest danger to the legitimacy of any election is the perception that it is truly the result of the people's will. And, we could get into a whole conversation about the Electoral College and all that other stuff right now, but, the Electoral College at this time, those are the rules. So as we all know, particularly Hillary Clinton, you can win the popular vote and lose the presidency. But those are the rules, for better or worse. What's important is that you come out of that election with a sense that it truly was a reflection of the people's will according to those rules. And if we're still in a situation in November where, people are reticent to be in public, or I hope it doesn't come to this, but if they're told to still socially distance, I'm hoping that's not the case, but I don't know enough to say for sure that it won't be. Well, then what do you do if you have an election where you end up with something atrocious, something like 35% voter turnout rate or something like that? And in good years in this country, in presidential election years, we sometimes tickle 60%, sometimes a little higher. In most years, it's usually just over 50%. But what if you start getting down to a point where you've got only 1 out of every 4 or 1 out of every 3 people really participating? That's a problem, because, again, elections only are really taken seriously by the public if the public has good reason to believe in them. As far as how this crisis is going to impact the election, that I don't know about you guys. I just think it's too soon to tell. The economy, more often than not, tends to be the guiding force in how elections turn out. And Donald Trump's lucky that the election's not tomorrow, obviously. But and I don't say that as a slight against him. I say that as a reality for any president. On the other hand, deserved or not, his poll numbers have gone up in the last week or so. And that is also a bit of a pattern that you tend to see during times of crisis. the person in charge, it tends to become more popular. That doesn't last forever. After 9/11, George W. Bush at one point had a popularity rating of 92%. Mm-hmm. That is the highest presidential approval rating in the history of presidential approval ratings. When he left office, his approval rating was 22%, which is the second lowest in modern presidential history. So politics is many things, but at the end of the day, politics is ultimately, what have you done for me lately? And a lot of people need a lot of things done for them right now.
Yeah, and I agree with that. One of the things, we're in such partisan times right now, and I think that's even true within the Democratic Party, for example. And one of the things that this crisis has seemed to do is cement this idea among a lot of people that we do need a little bit more of a safety net. And I've seen a lot of discussion around, so now we're going to have the federal government providing, a cash payout. I think it was $1,200 to each individual. Yeah. But there's been an increased talk around universal basic income or expanding healthcare related to this crisis. Do you think there's going to be like a fundamental shift in U.S. politics more towards some of those ideas that are usually housed in the left? Because of this, are people going to start to see a role for an expanded federal government because of this crisis?
Well, I mean, again, too soon to tell. I do think that the things you're referencing are inevitably going to become bigger and bigger talking points, and that's really a function of the increasing number of younger people who are moving into the electorate and the equivalent number of older people who are moving out of it. I mean, it's a little crass to say, but ultimately older people stop being voters because they die, and younger people fill that void that they leave. And so the topics that you're mentioning are values that are, I think, more widely prized by younger generations of Americans than they are by older generations of Americans. And I'm completely stereotyping there. I don't want to offend anybody. I mean, it's just true. If you take the concept of universal basic income and run poll numbers on that for 18 to 35-year-olds, you're going to get a figure. And if you take that concept and run it for, like, I just turned 55, so run it for 55 to 75-year-olds, you're going to get another figure. I will bet my salary that the latter figure is going to be lower than the former figure. And that's just, that shouldn't surprise us. Generations come and go, and they bring with them certain values that follow them, and then maybe adapt over time and then ultimately pass on. So I think that those things are bound to become bigger and bigger topics. Right now, today, literally, Thursday the 26th, is a big day for what you're referring to, Sam, because the House of Representatives is undertaking this bill that just came to them from the Senate. You just alluded to it, I think, that $1,200 cash payouts and things like that. I don't know how many people caught this, but there's a small caucus of Democrats in the House. Sort of their leader is really Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's just a phenomenal. You want to talk about leadership? Like, take a look at everything she's done in her very brief time there. And they are not happy with this bill that came out of the Senate, that was approved in the Senate by a vote of 96 to nothing, by the way.
Yeah,
unanimous vote. Every Democrat, everybody who could vote did vote. Yeah, there were, I think, Rand Paul was not there because he's in self-quarantine, and then Romney and somebody, I don't know who the other two were. I'm assuming that Bernie Sanders voted, because I can only keep track of three people who weren't there, and the vote was 96 to nothing. But this is a very divisive bill within the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm. Is that because of corporate bailout? Is that the area of division?
Yeah. So you want to know what I do with a little bit of my spare time when I'm not tracking coyotes or whatnot? The bill's about 900 pages long. I actually started going through the legislative draft of it last night. And, okay, so it's got 250, I made some notes here, and I promise I didn't plan this, I just actually have my notes right here. So you got $250 billion of direct payments to Americans. That's the $1,200 payout. And that's basically based on income up to $99,000. I was really pleased with that, it's $1,200 up to about $75,000 a year, and then it's slowly phased out between $75,000 and $99,000 a year. Now, maybe it should go a little higher than that. That's it. But the fact that you're not giving $1,200 to people who make $600,000, $700,000 a year, I think was a good thing. So that's $250 billion. Then there's another $250 billion of expanded unemployment benefits. Basically, and by the way, we just had the single biggest month, I believe, in U.S. history of new jobless applications. And I think it's up around 600,000 or 700,000 as of this morning. They were still crunching the numbers. That's incredible. Okay, those are even adjusted for population. Those are Great Depression types of numbers. I'm not trying to scare anybody, but that's a staggering number. And I have a funny feeling that next month we're going to see something similar. So you got a lot of people who are very suddenly out of work right now. So the other part of this bill, the other $250 billion, expands unemployment benefits. I think it adds 4 months of unemployment benefits. So there's $500 billion, which is a big appropriation. Half of it in these $1,200 payouts, and half of it to expand unemployment benefits. And when we talk about big numbers like that, it sounds very impressive, and oh my goodness, this is great. Until you really start to dig into how temporary of a solution that really is. $1,200, especially if you've just lost your job, is going to go fast. Now, granted, you've got these unemployment benefits that are expanded another 4 months, but it's a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, basically, over the course of the next 5 or 6 months. The other part of the bill sets aside, it's another I got to find it here, another $500 billion bailout for corporations and whatnot. Here's the problem with that. Saying it's only $500 billion, and I can't believe I'm saying only $500 billion, it's really a dishonest way to reflect that. Because if you look into the details of the federal law, $425 billion of that $500 billion can be leveraged by the Federal Reserve at a 10-to-1 ratio. In other words, they can take $425 billion of those $500 billion and multiply that factor by 10 and use that with really no restriction and no oversight from anybody to hand out money to various corporate interests across the country. When you do that math, that's $4.5 trillion. And it all sits there at the discretion of the U.S. Department of Treasury. Whoever the Treasury Secretary is at the time can dispense that, and there are no prohibitions really on how it's dispensed. They set up the one big thing the Democrats in the Senate fought over, and they claimed victory on this, which I don't think they should have done. They said, we now have an agreement from the Republicans to set up an inspector general and to set up an oversight committee. Well, guess where they got that playbook? They got that from all the bailout money in 2008 when the economy corrected there. These oversight committees that they've put in place, they have no authority to prohibit. All they can do is say, we did an investigation and we found that this money was irresponsibly divvied out to this company. And do with that what you will, U.S. Department of Justice. How many people were prosecuted after the 2008 financial scandal, financial correction? None. what we've done here is we've actually taken even more money than we used in 2008, and we've put it under the direction really of one person, and that's the President of the United States. You know, the Treasury Secretary technically, but the Treasury Secretary serves at the pleasure of the President. And it can be handed out in any way they want with no actual oversight, no prohibition. And so now I'm looking at $250 billion of direct payments to Americans, $250 billion of expanded unemployment benefits, and $4.5 trillion to shareholders, to to people who are not likely to be in the same desperate situation for whom that $250 billion is set aside for. That's a 9-to-1 ratio. So yeah, there are a number of Democrats on the far left who are really upset about this. And this, as much as anything, represents a bit of a civil strife. I don't want to say civil war, but a real division within the Democratic Party. And we're going to see that play out today and tomorrow.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting. I haven't read much into the package like that. I was planning on doing that kind of next couple of days, and that makes things really interesting because now that puts the House in an interesting spot where, you know, do they try to prolong this more and try to I guess change that bill a little bit, and then correct me if I'm wrong, it would have to go back to the Senate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, you know, then are the Democrats going to be put in a spot where they're prolonging the process more, but also trying to make it better for the American people? That's tough, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So, I guess moving on from kind of the package, we do start school virtual learning next week.
Yeah.
Is there anything that kind of, it's so great to hear somebody with all this knowledge on kind of the behind the scenes and the politics behind all this. What are you excited about kind of providing and talking with your students about next week for virtual learning?
Well, I mean, I'm excited to give it a try, period. Right. This is my 31st year of teaching, and I am self-admittedly somebody who loves the environment of a classroom. I like the energy of a classroom. I like to physically be in the same space as my students. There's like, this is wonderful what we're doing right here. But I won't lie to you guys. I think it would be a lot more fun if we could just all sit at a table together, like in the same space. And I would argue that it would be an even higher quality discussion. So, I mean, I think classrooms work the same way, but we can't do that. So, we have to, play with the hand we're dealt, so to speak. And so I think I'm most excited to see how my students respond to it. Or maybe excited is not the right word. I'm most intrigued to see how my students respond to it. I like to think when I was 16, 17, 18 years old, I would have, taken up the reins and hunkered down and gotten to work all by myself and, in my room or wherever it was that I did homework back in the day. But, that's ultimately what it's going to come down to is, we can provide lots and lots of resources, but just like an actual classroom, it's going to be incumbent upon our students to kind of meet us somewhere between the 40-yard lines. And I believe the vast majority of them will. And, for those who don't, maybe because they have other things going on in their life right now, I think that's the other thing we got to keep in mind here is that we may have some students who are caretakers themselves right now, if they have younger siblings or things like that, because their parents can go to work or be out of the house for late. We have a lot of our students are going to have real adult responsibilities and aren't going to necessarily have the kind of time that they would normally have for a full day of school. But I'm excited to give it a try. Those first couple of weeks will be, a lot of trial and error and a lot of figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And then we'll go from there. But, it's something new. And, Sam, like I think you mentioned the other day, it's a time, we don't get to choose our moment in history. History chooses us, and our students and we as teachers have been chosen to undertake this very unique situation and see how much education can actually happen. I'm hopeful.
Me too.
Yes. Well said. Well, thank you, John, for joining us this morning. We're going to move on now to how we've kind of concluded these video logs with a Shorewood Shoutout. The goal of the Shorewood Shoutout is to give praise and shine light on positive news that we hear going on in the Shorewood community. So, Sam, do you want to give us your Shorewood Shoutout? It's time for your Shorewood Shoutout.
Yeah, for a Shorewood Shoutout, I would like to recognize the members of the Shorewood community that are making masks for our medical professionals in generally hospital settings. I've seen a couple different members of the community offer different plans. I know Sam Knox offered a plan on Facebook. I talked to Mrs. Yanoff at SIS, who's making masks right now. I want to shout out to those community members who are donating their time and materials and expertise to making the necessary medical equipment for our medical professionals. Thank you so much for doing that. And in general, thanks to the Shorewood community members who are supporting either directly or indirectly our medical professionals that are working right now in the hospitals to help keep us healthy. So thank you for that. John, thank you again for joining us. And thank you, Stephen. It's nice to record another episode with you. I hope everyone stays healthy and stays safe. And I look forward to teaching my students virtually for the first time next week.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.